January 1944. Western France. Before dawn, a thin mist clings to the hedgerows, dampening sound and blurring distance. German infantrymen crouch in shallow foxholes carved into frozen earth. Their breath hangs in the air. Somewhere beyond the fields, engines hum low, constant, unfamiliar. Not the sharp mechanical whine of British armor, not the brute metallic roar of Soviet steel. The soldiers listen carefully. They have been told these men are different. Wealthy, soft, overfed by factories, and untouched by real war. The propaganda posters back home said as much. Jazz playing amateurs, weekend soldiers, backed by money, not discipline. Yet what they hear unsettles them. Truck engines do not stop. Artillery arrives quickly. Orders move through radios instead of shouted commands. And overhead, aircraft circle with a confidence the Luftwaffe once owned. From behind field glasses, German NCOs study silhouettes, advancing methodically across open ground, men carrying too much equipment, moving without ceremony, neither reckless nor hesitant. They do not look afraid. They do not look exceptional, either. That is what troubles them most. In notebooks, never meant for censors, in letters folded and hidden, German soldiers begin writing what they truly think. Not what they are ordered to believe, but what the battlefield is teaching them. And those quiet beliefs, formed under fire, are about to collide with reality. By the time German soldiers began encountering American troops in meaningful numbers, the war had already reshaped how the Wehrmacht judged enemies. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and won in weeks. In May 1940, it crushed France in 6. These victories were not only military, they were psychological. German soldiers came to believe that speed, discipline, and operational brilliance could overwhelm any opponent. The Wehrmacht did not simply defeat enemies, it diagnosed them. Poles were brave, but disorganized. The French were technically competent, but slow. The British were stubborn, professional, and dangerous but limited in scale. Each enemy fit into a mental category. By 1941, the Eastern Front hardened German perceptions further. The Red Army was vast, resilient, and willing to absorb catastrophic losses. Soviet soldiers were often poorly equipped early on, but relentless. They did not break as fighting them taught German troops to respect endurance over finesse. These experiences formed a brutal measuring stick. So when the United States entered the war in December 1941, German soldiers did not see a mystery. They saw a contradiction. On paper, America was powerful, beyond precedent. Its factories produced steel, aircraft, and vehicles in volumes Germany could not match. But soldiers do not fight spreadsheets. They fight people. And culturally, Nazi ideology dismissed American society as decadent, racially mixed, commercially obsessed, and softened by comfort. German propaganda reinforced this view relentlessly. Newsreels depicted American soldiers as undisciplined and arrogant. Cartoons mocked them as chewing gum instead of training. Political officers told Wehrmacht units that Americans relied on machines because they lacked courage. According to the narrative, the U.S. Army was a force of mechanics, not warriors. This message found fertile ground. Many German soldiers had grown up during the interwar years of hardship. They endured economic collapse, unemployment, and political violence. Military service promised structure, identity, and purpose. Compared to that upbringing, America seemed distant and indulgent. Hollywood films shown in Germany before the war portrayed abundance, leisure, and excess. To a soldier freezing in a trench, that abundance looked like weakness. Early indirect encounters appeared to confirm the belief. In 1942, German U-boat crews fighting in the Atlantic reported American merchant ships sailing with lights on, following predictable routes. Poorly defended submarine commanders describe U.S. naval responses as slow and uncoordinated during the first months of unrestricted submarine warfare. These reports circulated through the ranks, reinforcing the idea that Americans were inexperienced and naive. But these impressions were incomplete. The United States had entered the war late and unprepared, but not ignorant. It studied carefully. Its military leadership absorbed British lessons, Soviet experiences, and its own failures. Training programs expanded rapidly. Units rotated through large-scale exercises that emphasized coordination, logistics, and communication areas. Less visible than battlefield heroics, but decisive in modern war. German soldiers did not yet see this. From their perspective in 1941 and early 1942, the Americans were an abstraction, a future opponent, a theoretical enemy shaped by propaganda, rumor, and distant naval engagements. There was no sustained ground combat, yet no shared battlefield, where assumptions could be tested, so the belief hardened quietly. When Americans finally arrived in Europe, they would be loud, numerous, and technically impressive but brittle. They would falter under pressure. They would lack the patience for prolonged combat. They would depend on others to do the hardest fighting. This belief mattered, because armies do not only prepare for enemies as they are, they prepare for enemies as they imagine them, and by the time American boots touched North African soil in late 1942, many German soldiers were about to learn how dangerous imagination could be. The first real encounters would not come in France or Germany, but under a relentless African sun. November 1942. North Africa. For the first time, German soldiers would face American troops in sustained, large-scale ground combat. Operation Torch brought U.S. forces ashore in Morocco and Algeria, opening a new front against the Axis. To the Wehrmacht and the Afrika Korps, this was not yet seen as decisive, but it was watched closely. Initial impressions seemed to confirm German expectations. American units arriving in North Africa were inexperienced. Many officers had never faced combat. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was uneven. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. U.S. positions collapsed under pressure. Units withdrew in confusion. Equipment was abandoned. German reports were blunt. American soldiers were described as poorly led but individually brave. Their firepower was noted, but so was their lack of tactical cohesion. German officers concluded that American troops fought well when supported but struggled when isolated. The stereotype appeared validated. But the story did not end there. What German soldiers did not expect was how quickly the Americans adapted. Within weeks of Kasserine, U.S. command structures were reorganized. General Dwight D. Eisenhower replaced senior leadership. George S. Patton was brought forward to restore discipline. Training intensified under combat conditions. Procedures were standardized. Communication between units improved. German soldiers noticed the change almost immediately. Artillery barrages became more accurate. Infantry attacks showed better timing. Defensive positions were held longer. American units that had once broken now regrouped and counterattacked. The same enemy, previously dismissed, began behaving differently. This shift unsettled German assumptions. In Tunisia, American logistics impressed even veteran Afrika Korps troops. Supply convoys moved continuously. Ammunition shortages were rare. Vehicles damaged in combat were replaced quickly. German soldiers accustomed to improvising repairs and rationing fuel observed an enemy that seemed to have no such limits. Yet cultural judgments persisted. German soldiers wrote privately that Americans relied too much on equipment, that they avoided close combat when possible, that they preferred overwhelming firepower to maneuver. These observations were not entirely wrong, but they missed the larger picture. Modern war was no longer decided by courage alone. It was decided by systems. The Italian campaign deepened this realization. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. American units fought alongside British troops, giving German soldiers direct comparison. The contrast was stark. British units were methodical, cautious, deeply professional. Americans were faster, louder, more aggressive, but also more flexible. German defenders noticed something new. American platoon leaders took initiative. When plans broke down, they improvised. They called for artillery and air support rapidly. They adjusted routes without waiting for orders. This behavior did not fit earlier stereotypes of rigidity or softness. By the time fighting moved to mainland Italy, German frontline soldiers were reassessing quietly. Letters intercepted by German censors reveal this shift. While official reports remained restrained, personal correspondence admitted growing respect. Americans were no longer described as amateurs. They were described as persistent, as dangerous when underestimated. Still, belief lagged behind reality. Many German soldiers clung to the idea that American morale was fragile, that casualties would break them, that prolonged hardship would force political pressure back home. These assumptions would carry forward into 1944. But North Africa and Italy had planted doubt. The Americans were learning faster than expected. Their command adapted, their firepower multiplied. Their confidence grew not from ideology but from momentum. As preparations began across the English Channel, German soldiers knew another confrontation was coming. One far larger than Africa, one that would test every assumption they had made. And this time there would be no desert to slow the tide. The hedgerows of France awaited. German soldiers rarely spoke openly about their doubts, but they wrote them down. In letters home, often softened for censors, yet honest in tone, many described American soldiers in unexpected terms. They were surprised by their composure under fire, by their willingness to advance after losses, by their refusal to collapse even when confused. One infantryman in Italy wrote that Americans were not clever fighters, but stubborn ones. Another noted that once engaged U.S. units kept returning with renewed strength. For German soldiers, accustomed to wearing down opponents through attrition, this persistence was unsettling. What stood out most was scale. A German machine gun crew might repel one American assault only to face another, supported by fresh troops, artillery, and air power within hours. Soldiers began to feel that they were not fighting men alone, but a system that absorbed losses without slowing. American behavior was often misinterpreted. German soldiers observed loud voices, casual salutes, informal discipline. To a Prussian-trained army, this looked like carelessness. But, on the battlefield, the same soldiers followed orders precisely when it mattered. They moved quickly. They trusted their junior leaders. Race also shaped perception. The U.S. Army was segregated, and German propaganda exploited this, claiming racial weakness. Yet German soldiers encountering African American service units or integrated logistics crews found discipline and competence unchanged. The ideological narrative did not match reality. Perhaps most damaging to German belief was the psychological effect of American certainty. U.S. soldiers advanced with the confidence of inevitability. They expected air support. They expected supplies. They expected reinforcement. That expectation alone altered behavior. Where German units conserved ammunition and avoided unnecessary movement, American units pressed forward. This difference in mindset did not make Americans braver, but it made them harder to break. By late 1943, many German frontline soldiers no longer dismissed American troops. They feared their momentum, and fear, once planted, grows quickly. That fear would soon be tested under conditions no letter could soften and no propaganda could disguise. From a tactical perspective, German soldiers began to recognize a pattern that challenged their earlier assumptions. American units did not always maneuver with elegance. They did not rely on the subtle encirclements or infiltration tactics that defined German doctrine. Instead, they advanced deliberately, supported by overwhelming fire. When resistance stiffened, they did not retreat immediately. They called for artillery. When artillery failed, they called for air support. When air support arrived, they moved again. To German veterans, this was a different kind of warfare. It was not about perfect execution. It was about pressure without pause. One German officer described it as fighting a tide rather than an army. Positions that would have held against other enemies were systematically dismantled. Not quickly, but inevitably. German soldiers had always respected equipment, but against the Americans, equipment became a form of dominance. Radios worked reliably at lower levels. Trucks arrived on time. Bridges destroyed at night were replaced by morning. Wounded soldiers were evacuated rapidly. These details mattered. They sustained morale and reduced hesitation. German infantrymen noticed that American units rarely lacked ammunition. Artillery fire could be sustained for hours. Where German batteries fired sparingly, Americans fired decisively. This imbalance forced German soldiers to conserve energy, limit movement, and think defensively. Over time, Technology reshaped belief. The Americans were not superior because of individual skill. They were superior because their systems rarely failed. Perhaps the most surprising realization for German soldiers was American leadership flexibility. Early mistakes were acknowledged. Officers were replaced. Lessons were implemented quickly. Junior leaders were empowered to act without waiting for approval. German soldiers accustomed to rigid chains of command observed American lieutenants making decisions that would have required higher authorization in the Wehrmacht. This adaptability unsettled German command assumptions. The enemy was not static. It learned faster than expected. By early 1944, many German soldiers had quietly abandoned earlier myths. Americans were no longer seen as inexperienced newcomers. They were seen as relentless, coordinated, and increasingly confident. That confidence would soon be tested on a scale never before attempted. Across the Channel, preparations intensified, and German soldiers waited, watching the skies, listening to engines that never stopped. They knew now that belief alone would not stop what was coming. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Before dawn, the sky over northern France filled with sound. Aircraft engines layered upon one another until the air itself seemed to vibrate. German soldiers woke to a noise they had not heard since the height of the Blitzkrieg. Only now it was coming toward them. Reports flooded command posts in fragments. Paratroopers landing inland. Naval gunfire from the coast. Radar screens overwhelmed. Communication lines severed. For many German soldiers, this was not just an invasion. It was confirmation that every earlier assumption was about to be tested simultaneously. On the beaches, American troops came ashore under catastrophic fire. German machine gun crews fired relentlessly. Artillery shells tore through landing craft. Entire units were pinned down. From fortified positions overlooking Omaha Beach, German soldiers believed they were witnessing the collapse they had long expected. The Americans were exposed, disorganized, vulnerable, and yet they did not retreat. Despite shattered units and staggering losses, American soldiers kept moving forward in small groups. They crawled des Éclaims. They advanced without clear orders. Junior officers and NCOs assumed command when superiors fell. Naval gunfire adjusted closer to shore. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. German defenders began to notice something disturbing. The assault did not pause. Where previous enemies might have regrouped offshore, the Americans continued landing. More men, more equipment, more firepower. Each minute that passed reduced the defenders' advantage. Each breach in the seawall widened. By midday, German soldiers at Omaha realized the truth. This enemy would not be frightened back into the sea. Further west, at Utah Beach, American airborne and infantry units adapted to misdrops and navigational errors with speed. Objectives were adjusted. Improvisation replaced rigid planning. German units attempting counterattacks encountered American artillery and air support almost immediately. For German soldiers, this was not the amateur force they had been promised. This was an army that absorbed chaos and kept advancing. As night fell on June 6th, the battlefield told a story propaganda could no longer hide. American troops had secured beat. Supplies poured in. Vehicles rolled ashore continuously. The invasion had survived its most vulnerable hours. In German trenches, belief shifted. The Americans were not soft. They were not careless. They were persistent beyond expectation. And persistence, backed by endless resources, was a terrifying combination. But the true reckoning had only begun. Normandy would not be decided in a day but in weeks of grinding combat where belief would be tested repeatedly and broken slowly. The days after June 6th did not bring clarity. They brought exhaustion. In the Norman countryside, German soldiers fought not an invasion but a presence that refused to recede. American units expanded outward from the beaches. Slowly, methodically, through terrain that favored the defender. Hedgerows rose like earthen walls, concealing machine guns, anti-tank teams, and artillery observers. For the Wehrmacht, this was ideal ground. And yet, the advance continued. German soldiers noticed how American tactics changed almost immediately. Early frontal assaults gave way to combined arms coordination. Tanks advanced with infantry tightly bound to them. Engineers blasted gaps through head. Artillery fired pre-registered patterns. Air support appeared within minutes of radio requests, striking road junctions and assembly areas far behind the front. For German units accustomed to operating with limited fuel, sparse air cover, and dwindling reserves, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. One German infantryman wrote later that fighting Americans felt like fighting the future. Every position taken from them was not merely captured, it was fortified, supplied, and reinforced before a counterattack could form. Then came the moment many German soldiers remembered as decisive. July 1944, Operation Cobra. After weeks of attritional fighting, American forces unleashed a massive aerial bombardment west of St. Louis. Thousands of aircraft struck a narrow front. The ground shook. German defensive lines were pulverized. Survivors emerged, disoriented, deafened, and cut off. What followed was not hesitation, but exploitation. American armored and infantry units surged through the breach, with speed German soldiers no longer believed possible. Communications collapsed. Reserves failed to arrive. Units that might once have counterattacked were destroyed before they could assemble. German officers reported something new: American momentum. This was not the cautious advance of earlier campaigns. This was operational confidence, the ability to identify weakness and press it relentlessly, the belief that once the line broke, it would not be allowed to recover. German soldiers began to speak openly among themselves. They admitted that American troops were not superior in individual skill, but that individual skill no longer decided wars. Numbers mattered. Feel mattered. Air control mattered. And above all, continuity mattered. American units did not disappear after attacks. They stayed. They expanded. They absorbed losses without pause. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, Germany's last major gamble, confirmed these beliefs fully. German soldiers launched their final attack, believing that American morale could be shattered by surprise. Early successes seemed to justify the gamble. American units were cut off. Some surrendered, others withdrew. But again, the pattern repeated. American resistance stiffened. Supply lines reopened. Air power returned with clear weather. Units surrounded did not collapse, they held. German soldiers encountered American troops, defending positions far longer than expected, even when isolated. By January 1945, German belief had completed its transformation. Captured soldiers admitted respect, openly, during interrogations. Diaries recorded resignation, not fear of American soldiers, but fear of of a war machine that corrected mistakes faster than Germany could replace losses. The illusion of American weakness was gone. What remained was the reality of an enemy that could not be outrun, outlasted, or exhausted. And as German forces fell back toward their own borders, those beliefs followed them, heavy, undeniable, and too late to change the outcome. The battle for perception was over. The consequences would unfold long after the guns fell silent. By early 1945, the question was no longer whether German soldiers underestimated American troops. It was how deeply that misjudgment had reshaped the war. Inside the collapsing Western Front, German command reports became noticeably restrained in tone. Gone were the dismissive phrases of earlier years. In their place appeared sober assessments. American units were now described as methodical, well-supported, and operationally resilient. These were not compliments. They were acknowledgments. For German soldiers, the shift was personal. Morale suffered not only from losses, but from inevitability. When American forces attacked, German units no longer assumed the pressure would ease. They assumed it would intensify. Defensive plans became increasingly focused on delay rather than victory. Holding actions replaced counteroffensives. Withdrawal routes were planned before contact was made. This change in mindset mattered. Soldiers who believe an enemy can be broken fight differently than those who believe an enemy cannot be stopped. By late 1944, many German infantrymen expected American attacks to succeed, eventually even if they were repelled initially. Interrogation reports of captured German soldiers reflect this clearly. Prisoners frequently cited American artillery and air power as decisive psychological factors. The constant presence of aircraft created a sense of exposure. Movement by day became dangerous. Supply convoys were targeted relentlessly. Even rear areas felt unsafe. But beyond firepower, German soldiers emphasized something else. Continuity. American units rotated less frequently than expected. They returned to the same sectors stronger than before. Casualties were replaced quickly. Equipment losses were absorbed without visible strain. For German soldiers accustomed to shrinking units and irreplaceable losses, this created a sense of fighting an opponent untouched by time. German intelligence officers noted this imbalance with increasing urgency. Reports warned that American industrial output was overwhelming any tactical success. Even when German forces inflicted heavy casualties, the operational impact was limited. One internal assessment concluded that American strength lay not in brilliance, but in uninterrupted application. That assessment echoed through the ranks. By the time American troops crossed the Rhine in March 1945, many German soldiers no longer framed the fight as one against men. They framed it as resistance against a force of momentum, one that moved forward regardless of obstacles, weather, or losses. This realization drained belief, and belief, once gone, does not return easily. Yet the aftermath of these encounters would not end with surrender. The beliefs German soldiers formed under fire would follow them into captivity and into memory. They would speak of them quietly, long after the war, when ideology had faded and honesty remained. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the war ended, but the reassessment did not. In prisoner of war camps across Western Europe, Britain, and the United States, German soldiers spoke more freely than they ever had at the front. Ideology no longer protected them. Rank no longer mattered. What remained were memories, often uncomfortable ones. When asked about American troops, many German veterans offered measured reflections. They did not describe Americans as elite soldiers in the traditional sense. They rarely praised marksmanship or tactical finesse. Instead, they spoke of reliability, of predictability, of a system that functioned even when individuals failed. One former Wehrmacht officer summarized it plainly during post-war interviews. Against the Americans, mistakes did not accumulate. They disappeared. This observation appeared repeatedly in Allied intelligence summaries. German posts emphasized that American units corrected errors rapidly. If an attack failed one day, it returned better supported the next. If a unit suffered losses, replacements arrived, trained and equipped. If weather halted air support, it resumed immediately when conditions allowed. There was no long pause, no operational vacuum. For many German soldiers, this constancy shattered older myths. They admitted that propaganda had distorted their expectations, that American society, dismissed as indulgent and undisciplined, had produced soldiers capable of sustained industrial warfare. Not warriors in the romantic sense, but professionals, shaped by organization, training, and resources. Post-war memoirs echoed this theme. German veterans wrote that fighting Americans felt fundamentally different from fighting other enemies. Against the British, they felt professionalism. Against the Soviets, they felt endurance and brutality. Against the Americans, they felt inevitability. This distinction mattered historically. The war in the West was not decided by a single battle or heroic stand. It was decided by accumulation of supplies, pressure, coordination, and adaptation. American forces embodied this model completely by 1944. Even critics acknowledged this reality. Some German officers argued that American reliance on firepower reduced tactical elegance, but few denied its effectiveness. In the end, elegance did not win wars. Systems did. These post-war reflections also revealed something deeper. German soldiers realized that they had underestimated not courage but patience. The patience to prepare, the patience to learn, the patience to apply pressure until resistance collapsed. That lesson extended beyond the battlefield. It reshaped how future armies thought about warfare. It influenced NATO doctrine. It redefined modern military power, not as heroism but as sustainability. And for the men who once faced American troops across hedgerows and rivers, that realization lingered long after uniforms were folded away. The war had taught them that belief, once disproven, becomes memory, and memory, once formed under fire, does not fade easily. Those memories lead us to the final question: what this belief meant, not just for Germany, but for the history of war itself. War is fought with weapons, but it is decided by belief. For German soldiers, the belief they carried into battle against American troops was shaped by ideology, propaganda, and distance. They expected excess without endurance, machines without resolve, numbers without discipline. Those expectations were not born from ignorance alone, but from a failure to understand how modern societies fight prolonged war. The battlefield corrected that misunderstanding. American soldiers did not defeat German forces through individual brilliance or mythical superiority. They did so through continuity, through systems that absorbed failure and returned stronger, through an industrial, organizational, and psychological structure that made retreat temporary and pressure permanent. German soldiers learned this lesson slowly, under fire. They learned it when positions fell despite strong defenses, when counterattacks met immediate response, when losses did not weaken the enemy's resolve. They learned that modern war no longer rewarded perfection but persistence. This realization carries weight beyond World War II. It explains why wars are rarely won by a single decisive moment, why endurance often matters more than talent, why underestimating an opponent's capacity to adapt is among the most dangerous errors in military history. The German belief in American weakness did not collapse because Americans proved braver. It collapsed because Americans proved sustainable. And in the long arc of warfare, sustainability outlasts ideology, outpaces heroism, and reshapes history itself. Long after the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, that quiet lesson remained written, not in propaganda, but in memory, and learned too late to change the outcome.